After a big weekend in Serie A, it seems that Roma are sneaking up on the top four. Miguel, did you see this coming?
Not immediately. I suppose the one thing you could say is that finally Roma are now performing in line with their wage bill, because so much money has been thrown in this. And that will sound uncharitable, but it's not intended to be, because I think it actually does point to the value of someone like Claudio Ranieri in contrast to maybe some of the coaches they've tried, some of the projects they've tried, where it's essentially, I mean, there's a little bit of Carlo Ancelotti about it, a kind of someone who knows the situation, knows how to manage people, isn't necessarily the most advanced or sophisticated tactical mind, but it's almost a case of just kind of putting some shape on a situation that had been dysfunctional and facilitating it as a little bit. And again, people will think that sounds uncharitable. It's not intended to be. It's actually, I mean it in a complimentary way.
It's almost kind of genius of the owners to bring back an old school Roma coach.
Well, if you want to call it genius, fine. I mean,
they tried everything.
Well, they lucked out anyway.
They lucked out big time. They dug themselves an enormous hole, and there was one man who could get them out of it. And fortunately, that one man said yes. Because I guess Miguel's point is really worth recalling, because the expectation at the start of the season and the expectation, say, 2.5, 3 months into the season are completely different. Because Roma go out and get busy in the transfer market. They're very, very aggressive in the transfer market. I think you look at Mourinho's era and the reliance on high-spec players with questionable fitness records is an issue. And they realise this is an issue because of the way that they finish seasons. And so they realise they're going to have to move on from that. There's the whole saga, will he, won't he go with Paulo Dybala? The club really want him to go, but he doesn't go to Saudi in the end, which of course the fans are delighted about because he's an idol. You could argue he's symptomatic of that problematic squad construction under Mourinho. But they try and get younger. They give De Rossi the tools to make them young and dynamic, and then they fire him after 4 games. So this is a hole that they have created, a hole that they dig even deeper, of course, by appointing Ivan Juric. Now, if you think that Southampton fans are annoyed with him at first, let's go back to autumn at the Olimpico, where the fans make it clear that they're not having a bit of him. And it's not only because De Rossi is gone, who of course is a huge idol of Roma, but they just don't like Juric. You know, he's a guy who really produces scrappy, difficult, tough to beat teams, and he's trying to do it with a squad that wasn't built for him. And that really, if we're talking about what Ranieri has managed to do subsequently, I think we have to recognise where he started from, because he started still with that squad that cost quite a lot of money, as Miguel said, but with a load of bad results and a load of bad will. And they are so under the pump by that point. They're looking as if Europe has gone already. They're looking as if they're in a genuine relegation battle because the club, the squad is so demoralised. And so you think of Claudio being Leicester Claudio, really to steer them away from the bottom. And I suppose, Miguel, this has got sort of tinges of his Leicester job, really, hasn't it? Yeah. The way he's transformed them from being a team who are trying to get away from the bottom to
utter thanklessness as well, like to go into it, like, essentially, yeah,
totally. And it's easy to say from a distance, well, he's the one man who could do it because despite being 73 years old, he's from Rome, he's a Roma fan, he knows the club backwards, etc.
I did think, as you were speaking there, there's an element of, it's a phrase we probably haven't heard of about 4 or 5 years because it became a bit of a farce, but he gets the club.
He does, but he's also, I think, because he started from that point where he's like, let's get the basics right.
Yeah.
That's really helped them now. So I think if you look at the tactical shape of Roma, for example, switching to 3 at the back, and there's no smoke and mirrors. He's like the opposite of, say, Mourinho, of course, if we go back 15 years, wanted to pick a fight with him because he saw him as a genuine threat when he was in charge of Roma in a previous incarnation. But that they ask Ranieri, why did you switch to 3 at the back? And he's like, well, just help us control the play better, really. And it absolutely has. And so Mats Hummels, who wasn't used before, has been used a lot more since. Not so much recently in the last couple of weeks, although he had a big and unfortunate bad role in their exit from the Europa League against Athletic. But that three at the back as well, all of a sudden, Salamakers and Angelino are really, really useful in the wing-back positions. Angelino's been one of their best players in the last couple of months. And then you look at, going back to those big signings, one of the big problems, of course, when they went totally off course is the fact that you're looking at all these assets being completely devalued. And look, any club has to think about that today, right? When you're talking about the usefulness of a coach and is that coach the right one? Is he protecting the value of the assets in our squad, not just about succeeding from week to week in terms of points? Matthias Soulé, who they spent most of the summer trying to sign. Leicester had a higher offer in for him at one point, but Soulé dug in. He literally cried in front of Juventus directors to get them to sell him to Roma. He went there in the end, and all of a sudden, Dybala didn't go, and you're like, yeah, right, what are we going to do? Now, Ranieri, with an eye on the future, is still making Dybala feeling important, but he's not making it like he's on a pedestal. He's the one, and everything has to roll around him. He's giving him rest when he needs it, and he's bringing Soulé in and making him more and more important, knowing that he is the future of Roma. And I think Angelino and Soulé are probably the two most emblematic players for what he's doing.
There has been a big thing with, I think, taking some of the senior players out of the firing line as well, just to especially calm down how ferocious the atmosphere was getting in terms of kind of just the sheer kind of pressure on the players, how much had been built up for so long. And yeah, it's just, I think, again, classic kind of management of a situation. But of course, it does provoke the next issue that is kind of relevant to now, which is, and I don't want to draw the comparison with another manager who got a club in Solskjaer, but do you make it's a difference between a short-term job like this and stabilisation, and then whether because suddenly, well, we can already see it, the pressure's growing that he'll know to get the job in the long term in the summer.
Yeah. Wasn't the issue for Roma, though, the ownership, the Friedkins, for example? Miguel said that Ranieri gets the club, but does he get the ownership? And do they get him without sounding like a Beatles song?
Well, I think they do get him and he gets them. But of course, he's not the long-term future of Roma. That's the point you're making, really, isn't it? He is someone who's got an active role in finding his successor, as we know. Going for the youth vote, of course. He dropped a text to Gasperini a couple of weeks ago.
He's a wily old fox, though. They kind of know, like, he'll be aware of the situation. Because he's seen it from the opposite side as well. I mean, when he left Chelsea, say.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I think the thing is, with him, I think knowing that there's an end date makes it a little bit easier for him.
Do you reckon? I think.
Go on.
I do think that. I think the summer is going to be. As we get closer to the end of the season, there's going to be.
You think he blinks and doesn't go?
I think he'll be well aware of the lie of the land there.
That's really interesting.
Yeah,
I think the other interesting side of that, the other interesting side of that is how much the Friedkins need him to have a serviceable relationship with the supporters. Because without him, there would not be a serviceable relationship with the supporters. There's such an amount of anger when they got rid of De Rossi. And the Friedkins, I think there are two sides to their ownership, and I don't know if this will prove important with Everton going forward, for example, but it's the fact that money-wise, they're not ripping the club off. They're spending their own money to make the team better, to make the infrastructure better, but the feeling is they just don't get it.
Yeah.
They don't get the club. They don't get the tradition. They don't get what things are important. And of course, without recognising that, you can't have a workable relationship with the fans. So at the moment, Ranieri's the conduit in the middle that can smooth that over, that creates this, and it is quite an uneasy truce, but nevertheless a truce. But he's important in two ways. A, in being that, and B, if he can get them into European competition and even the Champions League, because look, Europe seemed absolutely impossible if we go back to November, December. But because of a couple of other teams choking, and I'm looking particularly at Milan and Juventus, they've got themselves in a position where they're 4 points off the Champions League. They've got 26 points in the last 10 games. Yeah. They've got an unbelievable home record. So they've brought back the best of the Mourinho bit in that they have this incredible atmosphere at the Olimpico, which, let's be honest, better Lazio teams have not been able to do. They've not been able to fill the stadium like that. And if he is able to get them in the Champions League, that is an enormous, enormous financial and spirit-wise boost.
It's just a outstanding management achievement.
Oh yeah, totally.
Even allowing for the money they've spent, because that, like, essentially we're not seeing the full value of that money this season because they had been so low for so long. So he's extracted much more than he should have in this time already.
And I think you look at his skill on a personal level. I think that's the interesting thing. You were talking about taking senior players out of the firing line. Well, you think of like Cristante, Pellegrini, who's the captain, players who were like the lightning rod for a lot of supporter anger, who were getting booed all the time. And for Pellegrini, that was an absolute heartbreaker because he's from Rome too, Roma fan, he's the captain, and supporters are looking at him saying, it's your fault. It's your fault that Mourinho got fired. It's your fault that De Rossi got fired. And actually, you've got to this point where all of those players, no matter how tough a season they had at the beginning, have been given their moment by Ranieri. So Ranieri, for example, when they beat Lazio, which is like, I guess, the real start of their good run, if we go back to January in the derby, it never looked like Pellegrini should have been picked for that game. And he had a look at him, spoke to him before training, and he's like, this is your game. This is your moment. Come on, do me a solid. Puts him out there, puts him in the team, makes him the captain, scores the opening goal.
Okay, he lucked out as well then maybe. But remember what Miguel said a moment or two ago about Ranieri being a wily old fox. I wonder whether his decision this summer to stay or to not stay will be based on where Roma finish up. If they do make top four, for example, Champions League.
You think it's hard for him to walk if it's Champions League?
Well, isn't it more difficult to bring in a new coach then? Do you not want the continuity? That continuity of those 29 points in 2025 so far? The
one thing there, and I think there's another variable to this, and it's interesting you mentioned the kind of the Gasperini point. From speaking to people kind of like who represent managers and that sort of thing, and generally in the industry, around a year and a half to 2 years ago, I remember being told that, and this is just, actually, it would have been around this time last year, because it was just before that summer where there was going to be a lot of big managerial changes, that Roma was seen as one of those jobs that was one that a lot of managers really quite fancied, even if they had difficulty for the last few years, because they saw it as somewhere that, with a lot of money in a big league that had potential to grow and where they could look good. And I think that has taken a bit of an issue, that's obviously because dysfunction has continued. Also, a lot of potential targets and managers that would have been looking at it like that, like De Zerbi, like Conte, have obviously gone to other jobs. So it does feel maybe they'd have to be a little bit more... And this is another reason why I actually think it could be another year for Ranieri, because unless they went really creative or maybe innovative or took a bit of a punt on a manager this summer, it isn't necessarily as fertile a market as it had been.
I guess that's the question, isn't it? It's really interesting to see him sound out Gasperini, because you assume straight away that he would pick someone younger and maybe there'd be a degree of handover. You know, someone that he would still be there to give advice, to step in if it got difficult and give them a bit of a hand. So